it's crucial to understand that it's the instigator's purpose that defines or distinguishes propaganda from other similar forms of activity, such as advertising and education. While the definitions have changed, the concept of propaganda has not really changed. But what has changed are the means of communications.
The first major state propaganda agency was Britain's Ministry of Information, a nice Orwellian term. The idea of information was to, as they put it, direct the thought of most of the world.
I think propaganda has become devalued as a word and as a concept. It has been defined so negatively in so many different countries, so that, for example, if you talk about propaganda to my generation, they would think immediately of the Soviet Union and of the communist bloc. If you talk about propaganda to an earlier generation, they're probably thinking much more about Second World War and even the First World War. But I think that what's happened is that the whole sort of concept of propaganda, spin, and all the rest of it has just become defined very, very negatively. Today, the news is happening every single second of every single minute in every single country in the world. And it's happening not just via television screens and radio and newspapers and magazines. It's happening on people's phones, on people's iPads, in people's cars, on trains, on planes, all around us all the time. The news is unfolding.
I think it is true that even today, people still associate propaganda with lies and falsehood as something to be avoided at all cost, almost a sort of cancer on the body politic. Propaganda is about persuading people, but it's also about reinforcing existing opinions and prejudices. And I think this preoccupation with lies and falsehoods misses the basic concept of propaganda, that it is ethically neutral. It can be good or bad. How do you measure the success of propaganda? This is a perennial problem. It's a very difficult question to answer. It's often cited that British propaganda in the First World War is a classic example of successful propaganda. Indeed, both Lenin and Hitler in the interwar period wrote that they believed that British propaganda during the First World War had a profound effect on the outcome of that conflict.
We often think of propaganda in terms of its very vivid, infamous iconography, such as Nazi propaganda and Stalinist propaganda, but really the most powerful propaganda of the 20th century and the 21st century is insidious, something that we often don't recognize, something that's disguised. And it comes from two words, public relations. Words that were invented by Edward Bernays back at the beginning of the 20th century when he said that the Germans during the First World War had given propaganda a bad name. He wanted to make it respectable. And PR, public relations, has not only made propaganda respectable. I'm talking about PR used by great power, such as states. It has made it both insidious and all-powerful.
Hello everybody, welcome back to Life and Life Only. This is episode 52, but I'm pretty sure this latest series I'm doing, well, it'll certainly go into episode 53 and probably as well into episode 54. So it could be the series that rounds off another year of Life and Life Only. If you've never listened before, this is a podcast that seeks to find inner and outer truth. Not expecting to find the truth, but often it's about the questions and the quest rather than any particular endpoint. The inner truth side of the podcast tends to be self-development, getting yourself in as good shape as possible to tackle the world and all its challenges, and then the outer truth is what's coming into you from the outside world. So typically news and the media, and trying to decide, is there much truth coming in, or trying to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. This series is about propaganda. This is mostly outer truth, but the inner truth side comes into play, I guess, when we realise that we are all subject to propaganda and we're capable of falling for it. And I'm going to mention advertising a few times while we're talking about this, because from the research I've been doing, which is mostly centred on one particular book, which I'll tell you about in a minute, it works because we all say, well, I'm an intelligent adult, I wouldn't fall for advertising or propaganda. So maybe another aspect of this, which we could develop a bit later, is the idea of free will. How many of our choices are free? Now, if I'm influenced to buy a hamburger, I don't eat hamburgers, by the way, but if I was influenced to buy, whatever, pizza, from seeing an advert, but I didn't directly go to the pizza parlour and buy a pizza, it could be that it stuck in my mind, and then I went of my own free will, obviously. Nobody frog marched me to the pizza parlour to buy it, but I was influenced. So influence is another thing. We're going to get to some of the words around propaganda in a second, but yes, what is propaganda? So I'm going to give you, my dear listeners, a few seconds to think in your minds, what does propaganda mean to you? What other words come to mind? Is it positive or negative, or can it be both? That's all you're getting, folks. Now, you can continue to think about that as you listen to me talking about propaganda anyway. It wasn't always viewed negatively. I'm not sure if it's been isolated exactly when it became a negative word, but it was certainly in the 20th century, the early 20th century, I would say. And public relations, or PR, is viewed by some people as the acceptable face of propaganda. It may not actually be totally acceptable in reality, but it's a phrase which doesn't, to most people, have a negative connotation. On that subject, a man who was often called the father of public relations was a gentleman by the name of Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's double nephew. If you don't know what double nephew means, I had to look it up as well. By two different family connections, he was Sigmund Freud's nephew. Anyway, he wrote a famous book in the late 20s called Propaganda. And one of the most famous quotes, particularly in the alternative media / truth movement, one of the quotes that everybody picked up on a while ago, including me, was this one. Quote, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organised habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are moulded, our tastes formed, and our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. It is they who pull the wires that control the public mind." And that, ladies and gentlemen, is not a conspiracy theorist on his computer just watching a few YouTube videos and deciding that he knows how the world works on the strength of that. This is a person that worked in that area, probably had a very good grasp of psychology, particularly human psychology, let's say, in terms of behaviour. So he's telling you there that the people that influence your life, I guess commercially, but really politics is now about entertainment. What's the famous Zappa quote? Politics is the entertainment arm of the military-industrial complex, and politicians have their own brand. You know, they're selling things to you, because if you take, for example, Kamala Harris, you will never get really a straight answer out of her. I've never seen her actually answer a straight question. So you get word salads and filibustering. So if they're not going to answer your questions, and if we say that quite a lot of people who vote don't really study policies, then what have you got after that? You've got whether you like the person or not, and whether they appear to you to be someone you can trust to make important decisions that are going to improve your life. So he's really saying that, in a sense, PR rules the world. It's a true ruling power of our country. And it's a few people doing things behind the scenes, obviously in terms of commercial products. People who work in advertising, they understand the subliminal aspects of it, how to tap into deep psychological mechanisms that rule most humans, possibly all humans, There's some very similar things that are tapping into, and your life is being moulded by people you've never met, and probably quite a small number. So again, this is something that's levelled against, quote, conspiracy theorists. They think there's a few people in a smoky room. It doesn't have to be a smoky room, but this is a guy basically telling you off the bat that, I don't want to keep repeating it, but a very small number of people who you've never met are having a massive influence on your life. Now, what we will explore here is whether that is necessarily negative or if they're doing it for your own good. Again, we may not find the answers, but we'll certainly have a good stab at it. And through the book that I'm going to introduce in a minute, it also presents propaganda in a very, very interesting and accessible way. Now, of course, when you're talking about a word like this, dictionary definitions are a decent starting point. And I've talked about this before because regular listeners will know I am an English teacher, an English language teacher. And I find it fascinating how language changes and words evolve and their meaning evolves over time. So I'm going to give you a few definitions. I'll leave it to you to decide whether you think these are accurate definitions of what you believe propaganda is. So here we go. The systematic propagation of a doctrine or cause or of information reflecting the views and interests of those advocating such a doctrine or cause. So, if you like, it's the selling of a doctrine or cause or of information which will lead you to support that doctrine. Another one, ideas or statements that may be false or present only one side of an argument that are used in order to gain support for a political leader, party, etc. Another one, material disseminated by the advocates or opponents of a doctrine or cause. So just to say that propaganda can be a method, but the actual thing they're selling or the thing they're presenting to you can also be called propaganda itself. So it can be the material as well as the method. Now on Wikipedia, the first line of the page for propaganda is communication, or propaganda is communication that is primarily used to influence or persuade an audience to further an agenda which may not be objective and may be selectively presenting facts to encourage a particular synthesis or perception, or using, quote, loaded language to produce an emotional rather than a rational response to the information that is being presented. So a few points of interest there. Loaded language. So loaded language to me would be perhaps a word that is surrounded by other words which will influence how you think about the word itself. It could be freedom fighters, what our enemies would call terrorists, we call freedom fighters, and vice versa. And to produce an emotional rather than a rational response. So that's another question. Is propaganda all about just getting people to lead with their emotions, or are you giving them something to rationally consider as well? There's lots of other definitions if you'd be interested. There's obviously lots of dictionaries around the world, but you get ones which are, in England anyway, quite respected, like the Oxford Dictionary or Collins. Now, one of the things I wanted to do was talk about synonyms and words we associate around propaganda, because I don't believe there is a foolproof and definitive definition, if that makes sense. In fact, on the day that I was getting my notes together to do this recording, I went to my discussion group that I have in my town here, and I asked everyone there, because we were always looking for topics just to start the discussion off. So I told them what I was doing here, and then we talked about propaganda, and again we spent about 15 minutes and we didn't all agree on what it meant. So I did look in a thesaurus, but I also came up with, I did a bit of word association with myself to see what else I came up with. Anyway, persuasion, deception, influence, manipulation, coercion, disinformation, hype, which might relate to advertising and marketing. Hype, of course, means making something sound very good by talking about it or presenting it in an eye-catching way. Indoctrination, brainwashing, and one that I came up with myself is lobbying. I looked up the definition of lobbying, trying to influence a politician or the government and, for example, persuade them to support or oppose a change in the law. Now, if you look at how many lobbyists there are in Washington, for example, I mean, there are thousands. I don't know the exact number. Not sure if there is an official number, but there are so many lobbyists and groups, and they get very, very well paid to influence politicians. And in some of my English classes with my more politically astute students and the ones who are interested in talking about this kind of thing, we often talk about, what's the difference between bribery, lobbying and hospitality, let's say. Because there's an exercise in one of the English books where they talk about what's a bribe, what's a gift, what's a reward, what's hospitality. And we talk about if you were trying to win a contract with, let's say, I don't know, a Japanese company, and they flew over to your city and you were going to look after them for a couple of days, you're not going to put them up in a 3-star hotel. That would just be ridiculous. If you put them up in a 5-star hotel, that could look a bit like bribery, even to the point that I haven't spent much time in 5-star hotels, by the way. But literally, when I was in Thailand, I spent a couple of nights in a really decent hotel. And there's lots of free stuff they give you. So, they're even getting gifts from the hotel that you're putting them up in. If they are going to stay overnight or for a few nights, I suppose a 4-star hotel is the safest option. But it's interesting, where is that line? You'll notice that some of those words are quite neutral, words like influence. That could be good or bad, but indoctrination, brainwashing, deception, there's nothing really positive about that. And just briefly to talk about the free will aspect again, just to continue what I was saying, when I stopped watching TV and I got rid of my telly, which was about 15 years ago, I want to say, just around the time I went abroad, actually. No, it was before I went abroad, but I used to watch telly abroad mostly just purely for the language. And because I've never been too fluent in other languages, my Spanish was fairly good. I didn't feel like I was getting any brainwashing from the TV because I was really just focusing on the language more than the content. But anyway, when I stopped watching television, I immediately stopped buying stuff such as clothes. I used to buy clothes like you wouldn't believe. And, that cannot be a coincidence. After I got rid of my TV, I stopped buying anything beyond what I needed, just a few changes of clothes and obviously food and so forth. But I used to buy designer stuff, and then someone pointed out to me, and this was part of some kind of awakening I had about myself and the world, the inner and outer truths side of this podcast. Really, that awakening for me happened at the same time, around 2006 or 7. Someone said to me, not only are you paying an absurd amount of money for whatever it is, a Ralph Lauren t-shirt, you are also advertising it on behalf of Ralph Lauren. That really hit home to me. But yes, this free will thing. So as I said earlier, whether you're buying a hamburger or a Ralph Lauren t-shirt, whatever it is, you can claim and make a very good argument that no one's forcing me to buy that. If you're paying with your own money, I've earned that money, I can do what I want. But there are various levels of free will and there are various levels of influence. It's not all on one level. It's not black and white. Rather like propaganda, in fact, as we'll get to in a minute. You can't just put it down to A, was I influenced, or B, was I not influenced? There's a bit of both going on there. Right, so now we're going to focus on the book Propaganda, Power and Persuasion by David Welch, which came out in 2013 to accompany a British Library exhibition in London. Now, just to be clear, the book is Propaganda, Power and Persuasion, which I'm not nitpicking here, but I'm just saying that he's essentially saying, I guess, that propaganda is a mixture of power and persuasion. And in this book, he talks a lot about powerful people and powerful organizations and how they've used propaganda. And obviously there's a persuasion aspect. And, persuasion is one of those words that I guess is neutral, isn't it? If you're persuading your child to eat more fruit and vegetables, then that's positive persuasion. Someone's persuading you to, steal a car or something, then it's not positive. I saw this book in a shop about a month ago. It's a big book in the sense that it's literally a large book of around 200 pages, but it's very well laid out. And there's lots and lots of propaganda posters and some reprints of documents as well to break up the text. And in fact, sometimes the text accompanies the visuals, rather like captions in an exhibition. That's why I wasn't surprised when halfway through reading it when I discovered that it was linked to an exhibition. And it was really exactly what I was hoping for. It was a fairly easy read. It's not a big book in terms of the number of pages. It's full of interesting details and bit of a history lesson really as well, because it's looking at mostly the 20th century here. At the beginning they taught pre-20th century, and the last section is 21st century, but really it's mostly focused on that one century. You might say really the century of propaganda. Now, the book is written, I suppose, from a Western perspective, but very importantly, it doesn't deny the UK, US, and the Allies, if you like, use of propaganda. When they're talking about the world wars, for example, it's not just the communists and the Nazis who are the bad guys using propaganda. It's made clear in this book that we do it as well. And that was refreshing, and probably the reason I kept reading it. I think if I'd suspected that it was going down one particular very, very binary black and white route, I probably wouldn't have continued reading it. The book is in 6 sections with an appendix. And what I'm actually going to do is read some parts from the appendix first. Now, the appendix is called A Century of Definitions, and it takes some famous definitions of propaganda or quotes about propaganda from each decade of the 20th century. Because we've just been talking about what does this word mean, I think this works equally well at the beginning of the book as well, or at the beginning of this series anyway. I'm not recommending, if you do get this book, that you start by reading the last part of it, but that's just what I'm going to do here anyway. So from each decade, I've just picked 1 or 2. Obviously, looking at definitions is to show you how the word has changed. But it hasn't really changed too much. I think if I read these definitions without telling you when they were said, apart from if I told you who said them, that would obviously narrow it down. But if I just read them, I don't think it would be totally clear, oh, that's a very naive from the 1920s, oh, they had no idea about it then and we're so sophisticated now. I don't think it's worked like that at all. I think propaganda itself has become more sophisticated and more subliminal. And that's, again, the link to advertising, you see. If you look at adverts from the 1940s, which you can watch on YouTube, or, well, maybe the 50s, because the 50s was when people started to get TVs. A lot of people in England got them for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in the early 50s. I've used those in my classes as well. And my students laugh quite a lot about how innocent they are, or how innocent they seem.
Hey, Susie Q, what's cooking with you?
Your teeth look whiter than new.
My teeth aren't new, but my toothpaste is new Pepsodent. Get with it, kids. New package, new flavor, new formula, too, means brighter smiles for me and you.
You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent. The new formula with IMP gets teeth much whiter. You can see it cleans the stains and film away, while Irium fights tooth decay. You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent. The taste is new, so fresh and clean. That new taste really lasts, it's keen. And while it makes your smile a rave, it also makes your breath behave. So start going steady right away with Pepsodent. Get some today. You'll wonder where the yellow went when you brush your teeth with Pepsodent. Pepsodent, Pepsodent.
Anyway, without further ado, right, from the 1920s, this is Bertrand Russell, who's a famous English philosopher. Propaganda, conducted by the means which advertisers have found successful, is now one of the recognised methods of government in all advanced countries, and is especially the method by which democratic opinion is created. There are 2 quite different evils about propaganda as now practised. On the one hand, its appeal is generally to irrational causes of belief rather than to serious argument. On the other hand, it gives an unfair advantage to those who can obtain most publicity, whether through wealth or through power. So like many things, the people that have got the money and the means can be more effective in persuading. That's my words, that last bit. Another one, this is from a gentleman you may have heard of, Adolf Hitler. Hope you didn't mind my little bit of black humour there. The receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Their intelligence is small, but their power of forgetting is enormous. In consequence, all effective propaganda must be limited to a few points and must harp on these in slogans until the last member of the public understands what you want him to understand by your slogan. Now, I like to think in the 21st century, those who do think, don't think in such a black and white way as to think that someone who is clearly evil, like Hitler, is all bad and nothing they say is worth even listening to. That quote could have been said by one of the, quote, good guys. He's just picking up on something there, and the receptivity of the great masses is very limited. Now, you might think, oh, that's a bad man talking about how stupid people are. But I listened to a podcast years ago by a guy who was an activist in America, and he was interviewing people. It was around the time, it was the election that Obama won. There was Obama, Clinton, and John McCain. He was interviewing people, I think, in the street and saying, who are you going to vote for? And they say, oh, I'm voting for Hillary, with such love in their voices. And he'd say to them, oh, which of her policies do you like? And there was this pause, often followed by a giggle from the person. Well, I actually don't really know any of her policies. I just think she's a nice woman. Obviously, some women like her because she's female. I know that sounds horribly patronising, but unfortunately those things do tick certain boxes. And if Hillary Clinton and now Kamala Harris says something that appears at least to be championing the causes of women in a male-dominated society, then that's going to be very popular among a lot of voters. I'm just trying to make the point that even though it's Hitler saying it, it doesn't have to be him saying that. It's just a rather perceptive point. That was in the book Mein Kampf, the famous book, 1925. Let's move on from Hitler before I lose the audience completely. Right, 1930s. This is from Everett Dean Martin, from a book called The Conflict of the Individual and the Mass. Propaganda is not education. It strives for the closed mind rather than the open mind. It is not concerned about the development of mature individuals. Its aim is immediate action. The propagandist merely wishes you to think as he does. The educator is more modest. He is so delighted if you think at all that he is willing to let you do so in your own way. So there's one for the teachers among you, including me. Yeah, the educator is delighted when his students are thinking for themselves. The propagandist is probably less delighted. Back to the Nazis, I'm afraid. This is Joseph Goebbels, who was the Minister for Propaganda. Notice in those days there was a Minister for Propaganda, just as there was a Minister for War in England. One of the most famous examples being John Profumo. Now it's called the Defence Ministry, isn't it? May the bright flame of our enthusiasm never be extinguished. It alone gives light and warmth to the creative art of a modern political propaganda. It may be a good thing to possess power that rests on arms, but it's better and more lasting to win the heart of a people and to keep it. Yeah, he's talking about there the fact that if you win the hearts of your, let's say, your audience or a captive audience, let's say, that's more powerful than just trying to rule them by force. Ruling by force works up to a point, but if you've actually got them on your side, that works a whole lot better. And there we got Aldous Huxley, of course, famously the writer of Brave New World. Propaganda gives force and direction to the successive movements of popular feeling and desire, but it does not do much to create these movements. The propagandist is a man who analyses an already existing stream. In a land where there is no water, he digs in vain. That's something I'm pretty sure will be touched on again as we work through this, about whether propaganda creates things. Again, let's go back to advertising. Does it create a need? Now, people like sugary things. Sugar is such a big part of everyone's diet, even if they don't actually realise it a lot of the time. There's sugar in things that you'd think have no right to have sugar in them. People like sugar. So if an advertiser persuades you to buy a chocolate bar, you're not buying something that's going to taste horrible when you taste it. You can argue with beer that, in fact, most kids of, I don't know what age they start drinking beer. I don't even want to know, to be honest. But with me, it was about 16, 17. I first had a beer and it tasted horrible. I first had a cigarette when I was 15 as well, and I smoked for a few years, but thankfully managed to quit. Something in my brain, after a few beers or a few cigarettes, told me that suddenly I do like the taste of beer, or I like what it does to me, and cigarettes comfort and relax me. There's something that happens there. But with chocolate, I don't think you need to train yourself to like chocolate, frankly. I think sugar, particularly processed sugar, it's a genius product, really, in terms of hooking people. It really is. Right, so let us move on. Sorry, folks, we're back to Goebbels again. 1940s. Propaganda in itself has no fundamental method. It has only purpose, the conquest of the masses. Now, I'm not sure about that because obviously there is a method. I suppose he's saying the purpose is more important than the method, perhaps. Let's move on. 1950s. Harold D. Laswell from Propaganda in the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences. Propaganda in the broadest sense is a technique of influencing human action by the manipulation of representations. These representations may take spoken, written, pictorial or musical form, which, although it's at the back of this book, is almost a perfect introduction to what we get in this book. I would probably just substitute the word representations for the word associations, because that's a big thing, associating... Go back to smoking again, smoking with sophistication. Someone I've mentioned in the podcast, and I may get on the podcast in the future because he seems to be quite receptive, is Rory Sutherland, who's a guy who works in advertising. He did 3 TED Talks, I think. 2 of them in particular are absolutely fantastic. I'll put them in the show notes, and I've used them in my English classes. And he said there's something magical about the way smoking is marketed. Now, because you can't smoke inside, there's a whole other subculture at parties outside or in the smoking areas outside in pubs, for example. If you go there, if you're in a smoking area and you're just gazing out the window without anything on you, people think, oh, he's a bit of a weirdo. What's he doing? Looking out the window, gazing out the window for 10 minutes and then going back in. If you do exactly the same thing but with a cigarette in your hand, you're a fucking philosopher. That's Rory's words. Perfect. When I was on Luke's English podcast, my good friend Luke Thompson, my partridge compadre, that's not the only thing we share. We've done some really nice podcasts in the past. He was talking in one of our talks about a guy who was fishing. Was it near the sea? Luke, you can fill me in next time we chat. Luke was talking about this. This guy just sat there for ages with a fishing rod in the water, just having a really nice time relaxing. But at no point did Luke see that there was any activity happening, like he thought he looked like he was going to catch something. So he could almost have had nothing, no bait on the end of his rod. He could just been sitting there with a rod in the water. Does it matter? Society says, yes, of course, you're just a weirdo if you're just gazing out the window on your own at a party. So yeah, context and, like I say, associations, I think is a word I'd use rather than representations. Right. Jacques Diancourt. Tout est propagande. It's my best French accent. Everything is propaganda. I'll leave that with you. 1960s. My favourite decade for various reasons. This is Bruce L. Smith, also in the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences. Propaganda is the relatively deliberate, interesting, manipulation by means of symbols, brackets, words, gestures, flags, images, monuments, music, of other people's thoughts or actions with respect to beliefs, values and behaviours which these people, reactors, in brackets and inverted commas, regard as controversial. Interesting. So those last, not the French one, but the Laswell one and that one, but were both from the International Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences. They're both saying a similar thing. And the reason I mentioned that they introduced this book very well is that in some of the stuff I'm going to read to you in a minute, if I ever get there, in the main parts of the book, they talk about propaganda methods, and there, as I said, there's posters and so forth, but they do mention songs and poems and all sorts. And it's obviously a very, very creative art form, propaganda, advertising, marketing, selling as well. We haven't mentioned sales yet, but that's intimately linked to propaganda. I can see now, 36 minutes in, that this is clearly going to be a 3-part series. Slightly afraid that it's going to be even more than 3 parts, but I think I'm going to squeeze it into that because I always like to start a new year with a clean slate. Now we're in the 1980s. We haven't got anything from the 70s. First, we've got Terence H. Quelter, Opinion Control in the Democracies. Propaganda is the systematic propagation of information or ideas by an interested party, especially in a tendentious way, in order to encourage or instill a particular attitude or response. So you can see that all these definitions, and these are not the only ones, there's There's a lot in this section at the back of the book here. I've just cherry-picked a very small minority of them. They're all fairly similar, and as I said, I don't think the definition of the word has changed that much over time. But if you put these all together, you get quite an interesting picture. And certain words come up here. An interested party. That's a good turn of phrase. So obviously political parties literally have the same word there, a party. They're interested in getting your vote, of course. Also from the 80s, we've got an Oxford Dictionary definition from 1984. It's a very short one. Biased information. There you go. Nice and short. Not pulling any punches there. Let's go to the 1990s. And we've got none other than the author of this book. I don't know if it's pronounced Welch or Welsh. W-E-L-C-H. Modern political propaganda can be defined as a deliberate attempt to influence the opinions of an audience through the transmission of ideas and values for the specific persuasive purpose consciously designed to serve the interests of the propagandists and their political masters, either directly or indirectly. So there we can make a distinction again, direct propaganda, indirect propaganda. That was from an article he did for History Today. And then 1990s, Noam Chomsky, who's done vast series and I think probably books as well on propaganda. If you just Google or look in YouTube, Noam Chomsky propaganda, there's loads and loads of audio and so forth. Propaganda is to a democracy what the bludgeon is to a totalitarian state. Brilliant quote there, love it. So the totalitarian state uses a bludgeon, a weapon, to beat you over the head with it, beat you into submission. And the democracy uses persuasion, influence, propaganda, marketing, advertising, selling, sales techniques, etc. That's why I'm going to leave it for the definitions. I think you've had enough. But I think if you put those together, you've got a fair idea of what we're talking about. Right, now we're going to get into the book. So I am going to go through each of the chapters. As always, it's very, very difficult to just cherry pick. But I had to because honestly, I will be here for the rest of our lives otherwise. This really is one of my favourite topics, one of the most interesting. It's not always the most fun topic, I'd probably rather be talking about music and films, in my spare time and stuff like that. But in terms of what I would consider really important topics, and a topic that's just getting more and more important as time goes on, with the internet, which is covered in this book, but obviously this is 2013, the internet has come on in leaps and bounds, and I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. Obviously it's the reason I'm able to do this, but it's developed more and more, and propaganda has developed more and more as we're just drowning in a sea of information. It's getting harder and harder to know what's true and what isn't. First chapter is called A Brief History of Propaganda, and the quote that comes with the chapter title is a much maligned and misunderstood word. So we are trying to put that right here. We've already spent time talking about the word and how it's evolved, so I'm not going to spend too long on this chapter. I'd mostly like to focus on the 20th century and some of the 21st century. I'd love to describe all the cartoons in this book. I will describe a few of them, but they aren't really a substitute for seeing them. And I'm going to say now, I've already said it, I think, that I do recommend you check out this book and buy it. David Welch isn't using me as a propagandist for him, by the way. I've never met him. But I may try and reach out after I've put this series out and see if he'd be interested in an interview. But we'll see how that goes with the cartoons. I think there's a few which are a bit easier to describe. Case in point, there is one of a man by a Polish artist whose name I'm not going to pronounce. The gulf between reality and propaganda threatens to grow so wide as to swallow the figure trying to bridge it. So there's a man. If you imagine a chasm, imagine it's ice breaking. So the ice is breaking and propaganda is moving in one direction and reality is in the other. And this guy is about to fall through the hole into the chasm. So the propaganda side and the reality side are pushing him in two different directions. And he's being stretched. That's the best way I can describe that. I'm going to talk about a couple of historical figures here. One of whom is Alexander the Great. I'm going to be reading from the book and interjecting, as is the custom, as I've done with many of these series, The Art of Happiness, the Derren Brown book, all sorts. Regular listeners will know what I'm talking about. Following his victory over the Persian Empire in the years to follow, Alexander is credited with demanding his own deification as the son of Zeus. Accordingly, coins were produced in which Alexander's face replaced that of Heracles, brackets Hercules, the traditional son of Zeus. This act of political propaganda was supplemented by the naming of conquered cities after him, a legacy that lasts to this day, most notably in Egypt's Alexandria, and by employing artists and craftsmen to depict him and his deeds in bronze statues and paintings. Alexander appreciated an important point about propaganda, that it was a substitute for his actual presence, so that his image on coins, statues, buildings, pottery, and art in general were present throughout his empire. He was effectively cultivating what we would call the cult of personality, a perennial practice of rulers, but one that has become such a major feature of political leadership in the modern era. Clearly, propaganda can be traced back deep into history, and they even talk about the pyramids, but this idea of having the leader's face everywhere, this is something that we would probably associate with North Korea nowadays. But just really to say that coins, is one way. A coin with your head on it is one way, because people, we live in a money economy. People are trading coins and notes every day. That's quite a nifty use of propaganda there. Just for my Beatles and John Lennon audience, I have another podcast called Glass Onion on John Lennon. The reason the Beatles made videos originally, they weren't called videos then, but we would call them now pop videos, was because they'd read that Elvis Presley had decided in the mid-60s that instead of going out on tour, he would send his Cadillac out on tour. And people presumably would pay money to touch this Cadillac, perhaps be photographed with it. That just popped into my mind when I was thinking about this, that the person who is trying to spread their leadership or their popularity doesn't have to be physically there. I don't know about you, but I've never actually met the leader of any country I've been in. Never actually met them in the flesh. So yeah, having that presence. So again, advertisers know this, that they've got to have their product present, and it's got to keep being mentioned, and it's got to seep into people's consciousness. So just moving forward in history a bit, between the 17th and 20th centuries, we hear comparatively little about propaganda as a term. It had but a limited use, and though ill-flavoured, was largely unfamiliar. Its practice, however, by those in authority continued apace, as witnessed, for example, in the metaphors of power propagated by France's Sun King, Louis XIV. Oh, there's another Beatles reference, Sun King.
Everybody's laughing. Everybody's happy. Here comes the Sun King.
During the English Civil Wars and the breakdown of the censorship and licensing system established under the Tudors and early Stuarts, propaganda by pamphlet and newsletter became a regular accessory to military action. And then they talk about the spreading of religious pamphlets, because obviously religion was such an enormous part of life. If we just take Britain, for example, if you compare it to now, it was obviously such a much bigger influence. So yeah, pamphlets and newsletters. Obviously with Gutenberg's printing press, which was, I think, 15th century, like many inventions that were to come, such as radio, TV, and then ultimately the internet, they all helped to spread this influence and these messages. Now, another thing, of course, that helped that was industrialization. And you could argue that increased technology through the years is really more opportunities for propaganda and, well, also sophisticated warfare as well. From the end of the Napoleonic Wars to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, Europe witnessed many changes. They included a range of smaller revolutionary and independence struggles, the unification of a powerful new Prussian-led Germany, and the emergence of simmering tensions in the Balkans as the weakening Ottoman Empire retreated into the edges of Europe. This was also the era of industrialization, which played its part in the growth of propaganda. In the most advanced societies, large and growing print circulations during the late 18th and 19th centuries, together with improving literacy, created new audiences for messages of all kinds. As consumer societies developed, so did a demand for greater political and economic rights, fertile territory for propaganda. So now we get to the 20th century, which starts with a section that's literally called the Propaganda Century. It was, however, between 1914 and 1918, those are the years of the First World War, of course, that the wholesale employment of propaganda as an organised weapon of modern warfare served to transform the popular understanding of its meaning into something sinister. By now, media such as daily newspapers and weekly magazines and the novelty of film had created something new, a mass audience. The means thus existed for governments to mobilise entire industrial societies for warfare and to disseminate information or propaganda to large groups of people within relatively short time spans. Once it was realised that the war was going to be an all-embracing and long drawn-out struggle, not apparent in the first months of 1914, the governments and militaries of the belligerent countries saw the necessity of a sustained propaganda campaign to bolster the home and fighting fronts, as well as to try and sap the enemy's will and garner support from non-belligerent nations. For Britain, primarily the United States. Yes, remember that United States didn't enter the war till 1917. So notice here we're talking about already a big development in the ease with which you can spread information. Large groups of people within relatively short time spans, obviously that has absolutely exploded. And as we are here in 2024, it's beyond mind-boggling. He makes the point here that, as is common with a lot of wars, the positive propaganda, if you like, is that it's going to be over quickly. I'm not convinced that they thought it was going to be over quickly, but that could be my sceptical mind. Also, they're pinning the not change of meaning, but the change of connotation of propaganda to this time. I'm not sure exactly it's that accurate, but, it's around then, 20s, 30s, if not the time of the First World War. And then they go on to say, during the 1920s and 30s, the exploitation of particularly film and radio for political purposes became more commonplace, most strikingly in the new authoritarian regimes of the Soviet Union, Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. It should also, however, be noted that Leon Blum's short-lived French socialist propaganda of 1938 retained a ministry of propaganda. As a new global war approached, that's obviously the Second World War, the French government revealingly chose in July 1939 to rebrand the ministry as the less transparent, I'm not going to pronounce that, but it's Information Commission in French. Why does he say most strikingly in the authoritarian regimes? I'm not sure why that would benefit them more than us, so to speak. Maybe they are obviously considered more extreme. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany is considered extreme right. Communism is considered extreme left. As you'll probably know if you've heard any of my podcasts, I'm not a great fan of the use of left and right. I think they meant something once upon a time, but now they're just used so randomly. Alt-left, alt-right, new left, new right, that really it's not clear what they mean at all. And I think they're part of a divide and conquer strategy on the media's part. But anyway, on one of the pages in this section, there's a poster. It's a Nazi poster proclaiming that all Germany listens to the Führer with the People's Radio. Under the Nazis, German radio became the, quote, voice of the nation. To increase the number of listeners, the Nazis produced one of the cheapest wireless sets in Europe. So, yeah, calling it the People's Radio, I mean, everyone's used that trick, haven't they? Politicians are always trying to say that they represent the people. Going back to North Korea again, it's said that, radios are only allowed to be tuned to certain stations, and that was a thing that was part of communist China under Mao as well. I think there's a reference later to the Little Red Book. We'll get there at some point. So it's this thing where you're just being beaten over the head with information about the glorious leader, basically. Now, there's a still here from the film Battleship Potemkin, sometimes just called Potemkin, Sergei Eisenstein. It's a Soviet film, 1925. And the caption says, "The massacre of Russian citizens by Tsarist Cossacks on the Odessa steppes at the Black Sea port of Odessa is the most famous scene from Eisenstein's film Battleship Potemkin. Although historically unverified, the scene and the film had a powerful propaganda effect. It was an early example of the power of film to create a poetry of unforgettable images. That's a great phrase, poetry of unforgettable images, to convey the Bolshevik message of the oppression of the masses and their eventual liberation and resurrection. Now, curiously, of course, that scene was basically stolen by Brian De Palma for the film The Untouchables, which starred Kevin Costner as Elliot Ness and Robert De Niro as Al Capone. But yeah, historically unverified. Again, this is not something that's unique to communists or Nazis or fascists. That's been used many a time by Britain and America. I feel like I know quite a lot about British and American history and their own brand of propaganda and British and American politics, both in the 20th century and now. I'm not saying I'm any great expert, but I have studied these techniques through the years, so we, in inverted commas, definitely do the same kind of thing. Moving on, the captive press in the Third Reich, that's obviously the Nazi regime, increasingly reflected official state policy. In the democracies where vague notions of free speech were cherished, direct control was more difficult. The French press, however, was notoriously prone to political influence, including subsidies from foreign governments. In Britain, the situation was less extreme, although Fleet Street was clearly amenable to government influence. But given the nature of British newspaper proprietorship during the 1930s, the press generally shared common interests with the government on foreign policy issues. So they mentioned their newspaper ownership and degrees of what is a free press. Now, go back to Chomsky, he said, America has an amazingly free press, but his arguments in his books and lectures and so forth tend to suggest that the people don't quite realise what freedom they've got, so they don't act on it. And as David Icke once said, we police each other. We don't really need governments to police us. We don't even need a sheepdog to police us. We police each other. John Pilger, who sadly died at the end of last year, you never got to see Julian Assange being released, used to tell an anecdote of some journalists from the Soviet Union during the Soviet era.
Some years ago, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, a group of Russian journalists toured Britain and the United States, and they were astonished to find, after reading all the newspapers and watching all the television, that all the opinions were the same on all the vital issues. Now, in our country, they said to their host, to get that result, we have a dictatorship. We imprison people. We tear out their fingernails. Here you have none of that. How do you do it? What's the secret? Well, the secret, of course, is that propaganda in liberal democracies, like America and Britain, is much more thorough than in dictatorships and totalitarian states. No imprisonment is required, no loss of fingernails called for. There is another, far more effective way. Unlike totalitarian states, the conformity of information and opinion is insidious. Its sameness implicit, ingrained, and even celebrated. Now, in the former Soviet Empire, the promotion of sameness was an obligation that journalists grew deeply cynical about. Unlike in the West, they knew exactly what they were doing, and the public knew too.
We have to beat the public into submission. Here they just do it willingly. I don't think Pilger was suggesting that, life there was better than in the supposed free democracies. But that was just an interesting point, that, in fact, people do conform, and they don't often realise they're conforming. That's very much a Life and Life Only talking point, I suppose. It's come up so much in the previous episodes. He mentions the captive press, and then at some point they talk about film. If you're interested in Hollywood propaganda, I cannot recommend enough a recent documentary, a couple of years ago I think it was made, by Roger Stahl, S-T-A-H-L, and it's called Theatres of War. That's theatres spelt the American way, T-H-E-A-T-E-R-S. And a lot of the research was done by Tom Secker, who some of you may have heard of. He was quite a big part of the alternative media maybe 10 or 15 years ago. I mean, he'd still consider himself an alternative in terms of media, but he tends to occupy this middle ground where he can see the limitations of the mainstream and the more conspiratorial sides of the media. But yeah, it's a very, very good documentary. Hollywood as a propaganda machine is remarkable. It's both sophisticated, but then if you take a good look at Top Gun Maverick, for example, I haven't watched it, but I watched some very good videos analysing it and podcasts analysing it. It's just really pure propaganda. And of course, we know from the original Top Gun that Marine recruiters used to hang around outside the cinemas, and probably got a fair few recruits on the way out of Top Gun because the film had made it look like so much fun, and you'll be the coolest guy and you'll be a total maverick, pun intended, if you join the Marines. And of course, they're always looking for mavericks as well. They're not looking for conformists. Of course not. Right, so I guess we're moving on to the Second World War here. The war witnessed a vast proliferation of media production, from state-sponsored posters, pamphlets, radio and films, including newsreels, to commercial newspapers, comics and military newspapers. The Soviet Union boasted no less than 757 separate military titles by 1945. He's talking about newspaper titles there. And as for radio, the BBC increased its foreign language services from 10 in 1939 to 45 by 1943. The US government inaugurated the multilingual Voice of America network in 1942 for external broadcasting, while at home the amount of radio airtime devoted to news rose from 5% to 20%, with 9 out of 10 Americans listening to 4 hours of radio daily. Towards the end of the war, the Nazi propaganda was also trialling television for a limited German audience. So yeah, it doesn't matter which side you're on, really. There's a natural evolution from radio to TV because most people respond visually. They've done tests. The majority, not everybody, of course, but possibly 70% around then are visual learners. Others are auditory learners. But visual things are generally the way to go to capture people's attention most efficiently. The Soviet leadership, under Joseph Stalin, untroubled by the negative connotations evoked by propaganda, viewed the role of the media as mobilizing and legitimizing support for expansionist policies. Stalin's determination to control the countries, quote, liberated by the Soviet armies at the end of the Second World War led to a growth in arms production and to strident anti-capitalist propaganda, which contributed to the growing tensions. The Department of Agitation and Propaganda, brackets Agitprop, of the Central Committee of the Communist Party fed official propaganda to the media, which were already closely scrutinized by the Soviet censors. We'll get on to censorship later as a form of control and propaganda. I love that, the Department of Agitation. John and Yoko's brand of what was called New Left politics in the 1970s was often called Agitprop as well, trying to agitate the ruling power. There's an interesting Soviet poster, actually from the 1960s, depicting an American capitalist literally conducting propaganda. So they've got some forms of propaganda and he's there, and quite interesting, instead of having a baton in his hand, he's got what looks like a missile, and his podium is a massive skyscraper. It's a good poster. If you think of, I guess, capitalism as an ideology, we'll get to the Cold War a bit later, but if you think of that as an ideology, then that was really a case where you've got anti-communist propaganda with posters and other things in the US just relentlessly, and then anti-capitalist propaganda in the USSR. Now, moving on, the spread of television as a mass medium from the 1950s opened up the possibility of a radical new level of exposure of civilian populations to the, quote, realities of war. The television coverage of the Vietnam War in the 1960s and early 70s weakened public support for US war aims in the region and exposed the contradictions in American foreign policy. During the first Gulf War in 1991, the term media war came into common usage, a reflection of the fact that the conflict was not just being fought hour by hour, but was being portrayed and watched as it unfolded. Now, I've got a bit of personal experience of the first Gulf Wars. I was 15 or 16 when that started in the early 90s. And I do remember at school, and I look back at this feeling some sense of shame. You know, we were all so excited by getting updates about this war. Of course, we didn't understand the war. We didn't know what it was all about. You know, we just knew that we were good and Saddam was evil, and it was as simple as that. As for Vietnam, I wasn't around then, but I have studied the Vietnam War extensively, and that's one where I would feel fairly confident talking about it in some depth. It's just a horror story, it really is, and that taught the American ruling class and the government, they're the rulers of America, it taught them and, you know, the media lapdogs to stop showing all the blood and guts on the TV, stop showing us the truth. We'll mention the Iraq War later on, but Iraq War was a quote-unquote bloodless war in the sense of you didn't see any of it on the media. All you saw was endless promotion of us as the good guys and all our weapons. That was the most sickening thing about it. You can look at clips now, and funnily enough, Bill Hicks, who many of you will know is a great hero of mine. There's only two stand-up comedians I'm really interested in at all, both no longer with us, Bill Hicks and George Carlin. Bill Hicks in the first Gulf War, around this time, early 90s, was saying things which were equally applicable to the Second War, and he described the news anchors having boners for the technology, you know, just gushing about this technology. And I don't know if it affects the way people think truly. I don't know how influenced exactly people are by news anchors. I suspect quite a lot, probably more than we might think, depending on your opinion. But yeah, with just no regard for the destruction that these beautiful weapons are going to cause, and of course to women and children as well. But when they do it, we've got terrible concern for women and children, and suddenly you know that you do see bloodshed on the TV when the other side's doing it. It's pretty disgusting. But yeah, the Vietnam era, obviously I'm interested in the 60s. If you know my John Lennon podcast, that is my era, even though I wasn't born then. And yeah, Vietnam is pretty horrendous. I'm not sure if it's the worst war in terms of all the deception and the absolute wanton destruction, but it's probably up there. So we're moving through history there, just in this first chapter. There's mention of 9/11 here. The 9/11 Al-Qaeda terrorist attacks on the United States in 2001 were, their sheer destructive aspect notwithstanding, planned for their media impact as acts of, quote, propaganda by deed. For decades, terrorism had been about gaining the oxygen of publicity for causes and to exert pressure on governments. Indeed, it used to be said that a terrorist's ideal modus operandi gained maximum publicity with minimum violence. But the adoption of mass casualties as a terrorist strategy, when targeted at the United States, provoked a furious response. Unsurprisingly, propaganda became a major feature of the resulting global war on terror that followed. The 2003 invasion of Iraq to topple Saddam Hussein was portrayed as part of the campaign against international terrorism and the threat of tyrannical regimes holding weapons of mass destruction. But it also became a plan for the, quote, liberation of Iraq by, quote, coalition forces. The latter, a propaganda term devised to place the US and British military in a flattering light and to give the impression of a broader group of participating nations than the actual makeup suggested. Media coverage of this war and the war's psychological dimension are of particular interest in propaganda terms. It witnessed a number of media innovations, notably the decision to embed reporters and television journalists as actual members of the invasion forces, on the one hand allowing an immediacy never before possible, while on the other introducing a new intensity of information overload. Now, not surprisingly, he doesn't question the 9/11 official story, but he is pointing out the deception involved in the Iraq War and the whole global war of terror. Oh, there's a Freudian slip. I said global war of terror, not war on terror. Yes, they're terrorists, we're freedom fighters. Don't need to think beyond that. Now, there is a section here on censorship as a weapon, and all I really need to say about that is that I think people are realising now that news is highly selective. They're not just giving you always the most important news. It's cherry-picked. When you listen to the news in the morning, it's been chosen out of all the things that are happening second by second in this ever-changing and complicated world. 6 or 7 items are cherry-picked, and they're cherry-picked for their effect as well as for their content. There's a quote here: writers tend to agree that propaganda confirms rather than converts, or at least that it's more effective when the message is in line with the existing opinions and beliefs of its consumers, reinforcing and sharpening them. We've talked about that already, haven't we? If you compare it with advertising, if you like sugar, then pushing sugary items on you isn't that difficult. I'd probably agree that propaganda does work best when there is some belief in that direction already. I'd probably agree that it doesn't create beliefs. We tend to think of propaganda pejoratively, but there can be all kinds of legitimate and functional uses. Citizens need to be more informed and must arm themselves with a greater understanding of the nature and process of the information age. In all political systems, policy must be explained, the public must be convinced of the efficacy of government decisions, and rational discussion is not always the most useful means of achieving this, particularly in the age of mass society, so instead messages are disseminated. They make reference to, in Britain, we often get references to the Dunkirk and Falkland spirit. It's all very simple. It's all giving the impression that we're all together. They talk about the Blitz spirit. That was obviously part of the Second World War. And I wouldn't want to play down for a second how horrendous the Blitz was. But unfortunately, whether they believe it's for good or bad, it's used. Things like that are used for propaganda and persuasion. Another question that does come up when I'm thinking about my own shows and when I'm listening to podcasts of other people's shows: how much should the public know? Is it right to deceive them? Deceive us, I should say. I am one of the public. For our own good. For example, if you really want to be depressed and a little bit terrified, just Google or put in YouTube cobalt mining in the Congo, and it relates to the minerals that are required for smartphones. A lot of you will, quite understandably, switch off if you start watching that, to know what goes into the horrors that go into the minerals for our smartphones. I'm going to leave it there. They talk also about black, white and grey propaganda. So just broadly, black propaganda seeks to deceive and encompasses all types of deception. It consequently receives the most attention when it is revealed. White propaganda is open and above board and makes no attempt to conceal its origins. And this is my note: does that mean the information is more accurate? Logically, yes, because there's far more chance of being found out, but maybe being more brazen helps get the lie through. Now, I don't know if it was Hitler or Goebbels. The bigger the lie, the more they'll believe it. The more brazen you are, the more you say the lie with confidence in front of people, the less reason a lot of people have to doubt you. Grey propaganda is obviously somewhere in the middle. The source may or may not be identified. I'm just giving you very short versions there. They flesh that out a bit more in the book. Now, when I was thinking about that black and white, I was remembering a famous Muhammad Ali interview. I'll just play that clip now, in fact, because I think Ali can say it in a more entertaining way than me.
Things are getting much better, but I always wonder when I went to church on Sunday. I'm not just a boxer. I do a lot of reading, a lot of studying. I ask questions. I travel these countries. I watch how their people live, and I learn. And I always ask my mother, I said, Mother, how come is everything white? I said, why is Jesus white with blonde hair and blue eyes? Why is the Lord's Supper all white men? Even the angels. I said, Mother, when we die, do we go to heaven? She said, naturally we go to heaven. I said, well, what happened to all the black angels when they took the pictures? I said, oh, I know. If the white folks was in heaven too, then the black angels were in the kitchen preparing the milk and honey. I said, listen, you quit saying that, boy. I was always curious. I always wondered why. Tarzan is the king of the jungle in Africa. He was white. I saw this white man swinging around Africa with a diaper on, hollering, oh! Do you all see Tarzan over here? Right. Tarzan? And all the Africans, so he's beating them up and breaking the lion's jaw. And here's Tarzan talking to the animals, and the Africans been there for centuries, and he yet can't talk to the animals. Only Tarzan can talk to the animals. I always wondered why. Miss America was always white. All the beautiful brown women in America, beautiful suntans, beautiful shapes, all tight complexions, but she always was white. And Miss World was always white. And Miss Universe was always white. And then they got some stuff called White House cigars, White Swan soap, King White soap, White Cloud tissue paper, White Rain hair rinse, White Tornado flow wax. Everything was white. And the angel food cake was the white cake, and the devil food cake was the chocolate cake. I said, Mama, why is everything white? I always wondered, and the president lived in the White House. And Mary had a little lamb, its feet as white as snow and snow white. And everything was white. Santa Claus was white. And everything bad was black. The little ugly duckling was a black duck. And the black cat was the bad luck. And if I threaten you, I'm going to blackmail you. I said, Mama, why don't they call it white mail? They lie too. I was always curious. And then this is when I knew something was wrong. Won the Olympic gold medal in Rome, Italy. Olympic champion, the Russian standing right here, and the Pole right here. Is Poland considered a communist country?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm defeating America's so-called threats or enemies. And the flag is going ton 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 ton. I'm standing so proud. Ton 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 ton. And I done whooped the world for America. Ton 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 ton. I took my gold medal, thought I'd invented something. I said, man, I know I'm going to get my people freedom there. I'm the champion of the whole world, Olympic champion. I know I can eat downtown now. And I went downtown that day, had my big old medal on and went in the restaurants. At that time, black things weren't integrated. The black folks couldn't eat downtown. And I went downtown and I sat down and I said, a cup of coffee, hot dog. The lady said, we don't serve Negroes. I was so mad. I said, I don't eat them either. Just give me a couple of hamburgers.
You can also think of black ops, and what better cultural reinforcement for black operations. These are, the ones I've studied are CAA. They're just basically illegal operations, but now they're a cool computer game. I mean, what perfect cultural reinforcement. I could do a whole series on that. Just the fact of putting things in a certain context and they just completely lose their horrendousness. Trading in the black market as well. Now, we live in an age where a lot of people, liberals, very woke people, just want to ascribe anything involving black people or the word black with racism. Now, it could be, that obviously black is a darker colour than white. It's the complete opposite in terms of darkness and brightness. So I don't think that meaning, for example, black male, black ops, etc., black market, I don't think it's necessarily racist, because obviously the colour, if something is I'm talking about something, not someone, is a dark colour, it's easier to hide. White is a brighter colour. Most people, if you ask them, although white and black are not technically colours, but let's not get into that. That's something I remember from school, my art teacher telling me that. Most people would probably say they prefer white to black, but generally the most popular colours, again, are something in the middle. But brightness is considered better than darkness, let's say, which is a clumsy way of me saying that it's not necessarily racist, but whatever the intention is, it's still a thing in language which paints black as bad and white as good. Let's leave it there. I feel like I'm just digging a hole. So I'm looking here, 1 hour 22 for the introduction in chapter 1. Yes, we could be here for the rest of our lives, folks. Strap yourselves in. I think I'm going to call an end to part 1 of this series. I'm going to say at this point, I think it's going to be 3 parts, but I think we've already covered a fair amount of ground. I hope you've enjoyed what we've done so far, and I'll be back pretty soon. You're probably hearing this at the back end of October. I'm sitting here on the 26th, Saturday the 26th of October, and I'm going to be recording more this weekend as well. I'll see you soon for more. If you'd like to support the show, you know what to do. Buy me a coffee or PayPal. The links are in the show notes. Any donations would be gratefully accepted and appreciated. Otherwise, just please tell other people about the show and share links. And I'll see you all soon. Take care and goodbye.